Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. I'd like to visit with you and with our audience today on Iraq. There's a war going on over there. Of course, it's been going on. I date this war from 1991, with the Persian Gulf War at the time, and we've been there ever since, bombing and killing. But the big thing is the battle for Mosul and how it's going. It's been going on for a couple days. It hasn't been resolved. So I'd like to sort of catch up on this. But, one of the problems we have is getting good information. We aren't confident that everything you read and hear is going to be the scoop. So I'm sure you have come across this problem that we have is where do we get our information? And is it the same old stuff, just confusing, or is there just even more manipulation of what we hear?
Yeah, it was about a week ago, I think, that President Obama, you may have heard, said something about, what a shame there's so much irresponsible media out there. We need to have some kind of a body to control it, and that's that. So it is true. I mean, there are so many more sources of information that are available, and the big corporations can't keep a grip on it. As a matter of fact, we were just looking at some of the analytics before the show. I'm a little bit off track, but it's interesting, and we noticed that an increasing number of our viewers are coming from overseas. So people are watching the Liberty Report from all other parts of the world. So it's interesting people turn to for news. But back on the topic though, you're right, and we talk about the media a lot. And
right.
I'm fascinated by the way the media handles things and looking at the way they've covered the battle for Mosul, CNN, CBS, and this. It's so interesting because it's a heroic struggle to free the city from ISIS. And every part about it is, in breathtaking detail, the horrors of ISIS. Of course, that's true, all that. But the way it's portrayed, and contrast that with the way an almost identical battle is taking place across the way in Aleppo, where it's also a town being held by terrorists, jihadists, and that is horrible. The Syrians are bombing innocent people. So the media just plays the government line to the hilt.
And sometimes I've noticed is that when you talk about ISIS, sometimes ISIS will be on one side and then the other. At one time we might be helping them, and the next time they're the monsters. And sorting it out is, very, very difficult, the way I find.
Yeah, and we're hearing a lot of atrocity stories about people living in Mosul under the 2 years of occupation. I'm sure a lot of that's true. I'm sure it was no picnic. But and then we're seeing a lot of signs of celebration in Iraq. The villages that are leading up to Mosul, when they're liberated from ISIS, a lot of celebration. But if you look at the alternative media, you see a lot of celebration in Syria when they kick out al-Qaeda at Nusra Front. But that's never covered in the Western media. And it's just interesting to see these parallels and how we're propagandized.
Well, I think that one of the interesting suppositions, and it may be more than that, is ISIS knew this is coming, and they probably had a plan. And I noticed that a city about a couple hundred miles from Mosul was taken over by ISIS, sort of a distraction, and then maybe it was recovered again. But this whole thing that they might do a lot of distraction. But the other thing is this possibility that may be ongoing at the moment of ISIS people who are saying, well, we're not going to all die we're not going to all die in Mosul. We're going on to a better fight, and they go up into Syria and join the fight up there. So that to me, there might be a token short-term victory in Iraq and with Mosul. But at the same time, it might be a tremendous explosion of activity, regarding Aleppo and what's going on in Syria.
And this is another example of, first of all, how confusing the whole area is and how U.S. foreign policy is impossible and irrational. Of course, in Iraq, fighting against ISIS, we're sort of aligned with the Shia militias backed by Iran. But of course, Iran is on a different side in Syria, so we're against them there. So we do know that it's being reported now even in mainstream media outlets that ISIS is going into eastern Iraq. And it may be the case where that might be an advantage to U.S. foreign policy, which remains Assad must go. If you get a few thousand more jihadists infiltrating into Syria, you can cause a lot more trouble.
But it seems like Turkey would like to get into the action too. They claim, or the reports are, that they probably have 500 special forces there. They would like to be participating in the battle for Mosul. And then the Iranians, threatened. They said, "Don't you dare do that, or you're going to get us very upset with what you're doing." So that's another factor. We have Sunnis and Shia and Kurds and the Turks. All these interests involved. Oh, then there's again, the United States has an interest.
Oh, that's right.
And it doesn't seem like peace is the goal. It seems almost like if you predicted if you'd have said back in 1990, well, no, the goal is not, to take over Iraq and provide peace. It's let's keep things going for a while. Let's keep the antagonism going. Let's not have a victory. Let's have perpetual war for perpetual war spending.
Yeah.
And you say, well, that wouldn't have been a bad prediction. But big question is could possibly anybody have a strategy like that, or do you think that they, just have unintended consequences? No, we would never plan to have perpetual war. We intended, to make it a democratic state and make them as good as we are, because we know all about honest elections. And even though there are a couple of people in this country who still believe that our elections could be rigged, can you believe that?
No, that would never happen, would it? But conspiracy theory becomes conspiracy fact. We did get bogged down. We have been continuously bombing. But I think also the people who supported the Iraq invasion are still dying to hash it. Die is not the right word. They're still desperate to have a victory narrative. And I think that's why the media is playing up the battle for Mosul as if somehow it'll erase the past 13 years of carnage and disaster that were the problem that came from the U.S. invasion in the first place. If we can just get a good news story about Mosul, everything else will be forgiven and forgotten. It's not going to end that way, I don't think.
But it's been safe to analyze what's been going on there for a long time and not be too far from what has happened. Because I remember I was not in Congress at the time that the battle for the Iraq Persian Gulf War, for Kuwait. And we had a group that said, no, let's not mess around with this. It's going to lead to trouble. No, it led to an immediate victory. Yeah, and then the bombing continued, and it led up to 2003, and it goes on and on. So even with the victory of 1991, the victory in 2003, a mission accomplished, and then the victory again, and then we have to have a resurgence of troops, and they took the troops out too early. Now we have another major event going on in Mosul. This is to eradicate ISIS. And even if they do seem to have another victory, I predict, and it's not because there's great intuition on this, but just common sense tells me that there's going to be no victory, because the setting isn't right for this. And it's going to end up more war, constant, and yes, maybe for a while somebody will declare a victory, but it is so messed up over there that the war and the factions in Iraq, it's long going up. When are they going to settle the relationship between Iran and Iraq and the Shia, who are more or less in charge of the two? So that's going to go on. So even with Mosul, that's going to solve it. And I don't think, I think people could sit back and say, this is a precise battle. We can do this. We can rout them, and we can have a type of a victory. But, I think Syria is even messier. I don't think there's any temporary victory up there to declare that all of a sudden, the country is once again a unified Syria and Assad is president. That's not going to happen.
No, and in Iraq, the U.S. is behind the government there, and in Syria, the U.S. is in favor of the insurgents. So you have a complete topsy-turvy. But, looking at the Battle of Mosul is interesting. First of all, I think the media is playing the numbers game. I think we have a chart up here that we can show who the players are. This is according to U.S. military officials via CNN. Total ISIS fighters, 5,000. Total forces fighting ISIS, 108,000. That seems pretty lopsided. And now we see in the media that just in this first week, about 800 ISIS were killed. They lost 20% of their forces in the first week. That sounds like a good news story. And then the media is playing this. They're delivering these good news stories after good news stories. But I think, as you pointed out, this excitement of a quick victory is not going to last.
See, what this doesn't measure is the acceptance by the people in these cities, because ISIS has been in there. It's not been very pleasant, but a lot of times a few people can take over, and they can be tolerated or accepted, by the community. But it doesn't. It indicates to me that those numbers there, that there's no way that ISIS is going to be maintaining Mosul. If they can, that says something about our training of troops and our giving the orders and our CIA and special forces and our bombs and all these things, that we can't handle this. But this was the same attitude about during Vietnam. All the money and bombing and killing, and more bombs in Vietnam than all of World War II. And if you don't have a moral high ground of being the defender of the homeland, because most people, in Syria we have the Russians involved, but in the rest it's a lot of local people who fight among themselves. But then we come in and we become that outside force, and that really makes it messy. So to have the different powers settled and come up with something, it's not going to happen. In other words, this war is going to continue for a long time. I think it would be a lot better off for everybody, of course, if we weren't involved in it. Our country isn't going to be less secure. We're going to be more secure. We're going to be much wealthier. We'll have a stronger national defense. So there's all these arguments for not being involved in this mess, and yet people. I mean, how often are they agitating over this in the presidential campaign? They talk about it a little bit, but it's really not significant. It's not a big issue. The American people aren't going to be voting for their candidate this time over foreign policy. I think it's incidental. They don't even know what the difference would be. And besides, in spite of some of their arguments, their foreign policies aren't too dissimilar.
Yeah, the difference is only slight. It's not a philosophical difference.
Right.
But when we started talking about the topic for today, we were thinking about winners and losers, what will happen, even if a victory. The other thing that struck me is they say that 1 million people may be misplaced from Mosul in this. So you can imagine downstream, if you will. Look at the refugee pressure on Europe last summer. How will that increase? Look at the pressure maybe on the U.S. I wonder, Hillary versus Trump, what to do with these refugees, what will happen. I think this could really be destabilizing to Europe especially.
Yeah, but who may be winning? Maybe it's Soros. Because his philosophy is that he wants disruption. He wants to spread people. It's a form of Marxism. Of course, their type of Marxism, there's always the elite that takes care of them, whether it's economic Marxism or social Marxism. There's an elite. And they may be the bigger winner of this, because just think of what it's done to Europe. Yeah. Because they measure it by chaos, because they don't want borders. They want one world, one world government.
Yeah.
Less emphasis on borders doesn't necessarily bother me, as long as you have private property and different things. But to get rid of borders and then have a super government, it's sort of like trade. Yeah, we'll have free trade, but we're going to have managed trade by the WTO. So it's completely different. So I think right now probably one of the biggest victors will be the social Marxists, cultural Marxism. Because even in this country, because it's hard to believe the American people wouldn't ever think that there's people in our government that would be called cultural Marxists.
Yeah.
And yet, what do? And I do support a lot of openness in travel and in immigration if it's done on a voluntary agreement and no subsidies and no coercion and no taxation, this sort of thing.
Sure.
So here we have a president by edict, by a presidential order, can decide, oh, should we bring in 5,000 or 100,000? And I'll tell them they'll go to this city and this city, and we'll give them a lot of money, and it'll be good for the economy. And this is moral. This is morally correct that you don't have you're a bunch of bigots if you're not for this. So cultural Marxism looks like they might be one of the biggest victors here.
But I think there already is a backlash forming in Europe, and I think it's going to rip Europe apart in many ways. You know, Hungary, led by Viktor Orban, has really been up front in resisting Brussels' demands that they accept refugees. And they've been joined by a couple of the other former Soviet satellite countries in the East and Central Europe. The other issue is we have presidential elections in France coming up, where you see the rise of the National Front Party, which is very strongly anti-immigrant. You've seen you've seen some early election victories for the Alliance for Germany in Germany, the anti-immigrant party. So and we saw Brexit, which to a degree I think was motivated by the immigration issue. So you're seeing really splits in Europe. How is Europe going to be able to hold itself together, especially with 1 million new people knocking on its door?
And I want to make it as clear as I can. There's a big difference between an orchestrated migration for the purpose of reassembling the people of the world and charging the people through taxation and welfare programs and forcing it upon them, compared to a voluntary migration problem that this country has welcomed. I mean, if you take the people who suffered under Castro, thousands of people came in here in different countries like this. This was a little bit different, but always the government gets involved. You know, originally our immigration policies involved, having a sponsored and they got paid for, and you weren't handed a government check of thousands and thousands of dollars and getting, all kinds of benefits. So there's a big difference between the two, but it starts, it encourages this type of problem. Of course, with the foreign policy, they said that we should be over there remaking the Middle East, and all of a sudden it doesn't work out as well as it should.
Yeah. Speaking of Viktor Orban, he said in an interview yesterday that the U.S.'s forced democracy program is failing everywhere. So I think they're starting to get it.
Well, maybe someday the world will wake up and the American people will wake up and take a lead from the founders. They couldn't stand the word democracy because it was dictatorship of the majority. And that's not the way you protect individual liberties. And yet that is what we do. We call ourselves the exceptional nations, and we have to spread our goodness around the world, and we have to make sure that we have democratic elections. I think, fine, if we set a good example, maybe somebody will copy us. But believe me, from the very time I first ran for office and got exposed to corruption and politics to this very day when we talk about our elections, we have a long way to go from a system that really is very, very discriminatory against any alternative than the single party, which is called Democrat-Republican. That's a single party, and no matter how much they argue, the policies do not change. We still endorse bad economics, bad monetary policy, bad foreign policy. So we need more, individual choices. And it's not made by the dictatorship of the majority, which is what the founders didn't want. They wanted us to have a republic, and yet we ended up with a mess right now, and that's part of what has led to our problem in foreign policy, domestic policy, as well as our social policy. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.